a tour of the brain, the spinal cord cross-section, the ventricles of the brain, and the neuron. So I'm going to start with the brain since it is the main one. I'm going to start with the whole brain here. There may be one whole, but mostly it'll be in cross-section. The mid-sagittal view is the one that you're going to be most interested in. Okay, so what we're looking at here is this is the longitudinal fissure. You may see it with a different name somewhere. If you find it with a different name and you use that, that's totally fine as well. If you find it in your book and it's called something different, then just call it that. I know it is the longitudinal fissure. I'm also going to be asking you the lobes of the brain. Anybody have a guess what the lobes of the brain are named after, if you had to guess?
The skull part.
Well, what's on the outside of it? The skull?
The muscles.
On the outside of the brain is the skull, right?
Yes.
Do the skull parts have names?
Yes.
Okay, so these lobes are named for the bones. Okay, so if you guys remember the bones, do you remember the back, what this is called? Occipital lobe. Okay, this is primarily responsible for vision. How about up on top on the sides? Parietal lobes, very good. And then in the front? Frontal lobes, very good. How about here on the side? Temporal lobes. Okay, and that is it for the lobes. All right. I may ask you, what is the name of this raised, any of these raised portion here? That's called a gyrus. Gyrus is the raised part and sulcus is the kind of indentation in between them. I think I've got that right. If I say anything off, it's because it's been a long time since I've done one of these tours, but I'm pretty sure that's right. Okay, a couple of other things. This large brown thing down below is called the cerebellum. This is responsible for primarily learned behaviors. For example, if you can play piano and you don't have to think much about it, that's because it's stored in the cerebellum. Okay, moving down below from the outside, we're going to do it again on the inside. We've got here, this is the olfactory bulb. This is where all the neurons from your nose come up and synapse or link together before they go on to the rest of the brain. This is called the olfactory tract, this white thing here. So olfactory bulb, olfactory tract. Just above it, this small white thing here is called the optic nerve. And right where they cross in the middle is called the optic chiasm. Chiasm means crossing. All right. This here is called the pituitary gland. It is officially part of the endocrine system, but because it's also part of the brain, it will be on this test having to do with the brain. Okay. Pituitary is the master gland, only controlled itself by the hypothalamus, which is deeper in the brain that I will show you. Okay. This swollen area here and here is called the pons. It's responsible for keeping you alive, coughing reflexes, swallowing reflexes, blood pressure, things like that. And then right below that is the medulla or medulla oblongata. Okay? I'm trying to think if there's anything else on the outside. That's it for the outside. So now we're going to do cross-section. This is most of the questions here. Okay? We're going to start, kind of move our way downwards. So this big white thing here is called the corpus callosum. Now, corpus means body, and colossus, I'm sure you would guess, means large, right? Or huge, like colossal. So the corpus callosum, what its job is to communicate. You guys know you have two halves to your brain, right? Well, the right side has to communicate with the left side, and the corpus callosum allows the communication between the two hemispheres. Now, interesting little side note, you guys have heard of epilepsy before, right? In some forms of epilepsy, the problem is caused by kind of storms, electrical storms in the brain, crossing back and forth between the two sides. And what they do what's called a cholecystectomy, and they'll cut the corpus callosum, and that diminishes most of the effects or problems associated with that type of epilepsy. So it's kind of an interesting demonstration of why it's so important, the corpus callosum. Okay, so let's keep moving here. Remember this large brown thing was called the cerebellum. This thing up here is called the cerebrum. So the big pink thing on top, cerebrum and cerebral lobes. Cerebral hemisphere means half of a sphere. So cerebral hemisphere, cerebral lobes, cerebellum. And then within the cerebellum is this white thing that looks like a bush. Its name is arbor vitae, V-I-T-A-E, and it literally means tree of life. When they looked at it under the microscope for the first time, it looked like a tree. And so arbor means tree, vitae means life in Latin. And really what it is, it's the white matter connecting all the gray matter in the cerebellum, communicating out with the rest of the brain. Okay? So let's keep moving our way down. This one is really hard to see. I'm not going to give you this pellucida, this membrane thing. You can't really see it unless you have a whole brain. So I'm going to skip that. This pink thing, on almost every one of my tests. By the way, on this particular model, there won't be any clay. Anybody have a guess why it won't be any clay? It's soft, right? I can put the pins right in it. Okay, so keep that in mind. What did I call this again?
You didn't.
Choroid plexus. I did. I didn't?
No.
Maybe I meant to, and I didn't. Okay. This pink thing, I always ask it. Okay, choroid plexus. Choroid means colorful. Plexus means center. So it's a colorful center, and what it does is it makes the cerebral spinal fluid that circulates within your brain, so your brain can float. You guys have heard of CSF, right? Mm-hmm. Or a spinal tap where they draw CSF. Mm-hmm. That comes from this is where it's made, the choroid plexus. You know, I'm not asking the function specifically, but it might help you remember it if you know what it's for. Okay, these two little white structures here and here make up what is called the corpora quadrigemina. Now, if you guys remember, corpus, corpora means body, and what do you think quad means? Four. So there's two here and two on the other side, two little tiny bodies. And so that's why they call it the corpora quadrigemina.
Can you point that out again real quick?
Here and here.
Okay.
Here and here. Corpora quadrigemina. Now, one of these is the pineal gland. I want to say the upper one here is the pineal gland of the corpora quadrigemina. The pineal gland produces melatonin, which some people take as a supplement to help them sleep. So the pineal gland produces melatonin for sleep. Okay, moving our way down, this brown thing is called the interthalamic adhesion. Now, why did they call it that? Well, just behind it is a swollen area called the thalamus. I said something earlier called the hypothalamus. The thalamus is above the hypothalamus because hypo means below. Does that make sense? Hypo is below. So the thalamus is the area around this brown dot. The brown dot is called the interthalamic adhesion because it holds the two sides of the thalamus together. So just around it is the thalamus and just the area right in here. Now, this one is a tough one. So you guys got to watch my video carefully. It's a little kind of V-shaped structure right here with a little notch in it. Completely uninteresting visually. This area right here. This is called the hypothalamus. This area just below the thalamus, below that circular area where the interthalamic adhesion was there. This triangular notched area controls all of the endocrine physiology in the body. So it sends signals to the pituitary sends signals to all the rest of your glands, and the glands then control your body chemistry. So the hypothalamus right there is almost always on my test, and it controls the endocrine system, which are hormones, okay? Now moving down, I pointed this out from the outside. This is called the optic chiasm, where the two sides cross. I don't know if you guys know, but the right eye transfers across to the left side of your brain back at the occipital lobe, and the same thing with your left eye crosses to the right. And where they cross is called the optic chiasm, or crossing. All right? This small dot right here is called the mammillary body. I've never heard a good reason for why it was named other than maybe the first guy that saw it might have thought it looked like a woman's breast. And mammary glands and breasts kind of go together, right? And it's logical, but if that's a way to help you remember it, great. All right, so let's keep moving down. From the outside, there's the pons, this big oval. There's the medulla. These are both responsible, what you would call your lizard brain, responsible for keeping you alive, reflexes, etc. Okay, so let's talk about some of the little holes in here. I don't know if you guys can see very well from this, but this pink area is slightly dipped below the white area. So it's kind of an empty space, and this over here is what would be filled into those spaces. So I'm going to go over this, and then after I finish with this, but then you'll see how this kind of links together with these gaps or holes in your brain. You have holes in your brain that are full of CSF, okay? So the lateral ventricles, which are these large ones, you can't see because they're embedded laterally in the brain. When you look at cross sections of the brain, which we also have, you can see those lateral ventricles. But here they are here. So you can't see them in the mid-sagittal section. I'm sure you guys know what that means by now, right? But you can see the third ventricle, which is right here. The third ventricle is this area right in between the two thalami, and you see the hole there is right where the interthalamic adhesion would be, okay? So then the CSF is made right here at the choroid plexus, goes into that third ventricle through this tube connecting. There's a tube that goes down there. It's called the cerebral aqueduct. There's other names for it. If you find other names for it, that's cool too, but I always called it the cerebral aqueduct, or there was other terms for it. But anyway, that's close enough. This tube here is the aqueduct, and that's shown on this model here as this little tiny tube. And you can still see some red there from when I put clay on here from a previous exam. Okay? Now, if we keep moving down this aqueduct, you get to what is called the fourth ventricle. You guys have heard of ventricles in your heart, right? Mm-hmm. It just basically means a large open space holding fluid. That's what a ventricle means. So this is the fourth ventricle, and the way to know that is it's just anterior to the cerebellum, okay? And then the rest of this goes down through the center of the spinal cord. Let's see, did I forget anything? I don't think that I did. There are other spinal nerves here, but they're too small, difficult to see, so I'm not going to ask you. So that's pretty much it for the brain, okay? Now we're going to switch back to this. I did give you guys the references to this. Please note that the stand for these has a QR code, so you're going to want to scan that and get the names for it. Remember, if the names differ from the names I give it, I will give credit for either one, but I do prefer the one that I'm familiar with, just because I'm stuck in my ways. All right, so we have these two things. I kind of like to think of this structure as like an alien bird with the big wings here curving around, the body in the center, a tail, and then the tail feathers, okay? So these two big wings to this model would be representative if you poured plastic into the gaps that were normally filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So this is really a model of the cerebrospinal fluid. So these are the lateral ventricles. So 1 and 2, or 1 and 2, they're not numbered. They're just 1 and 2, the lateral ventricles. And then you get to the third one here, which looks kind of like the head of a bird and then a big spot underneath its body. It's very bird-like. So the third ventricle, okay? Then we said before, this is the cerebral aqueduct. This is the fluid that's in the cerebral aqueduct. And then the fourth ventricle is here. Do you see that? So this will also be on the lab exam. It's called the ventricles model. And would you like to take one of those down to the library? Okay, good. And a brain. Okay, so we did a brain, we did the ventricles model, onto a neuron. So this is an individual neuron that you would find in the peripheral nervous system. This is not a neuron that you would find in the brain. The ones in the brain have a very different structure. This is what you'd find out in your arms and legs. Okay, there's two sections to it. So instead of having a really long model, they cut it and put the two pieces adjacent. We're going to start with the cell body, which is this whole area here. And right in the center, remember at the beginning of the semester, I said if it's a large circular thing in the middle of a cell and you don't know what it's called, what do you call it?
Nucleus.
The nucleus, right. So there's the nucleus. The little blue things I never put on my test, but they're called missile bodies, in case you're curious. And these little knobs here are not actually part of this neuron. There are other neurons coming and synapsing with it. Now, if you remember my lecture or you've had physiology at all, you know what a synapse is. It's a connection between two neurons. So these little rubbery tan things are where adjacent or nearby neurons are sending their axon termini or terminuses to connect or give information to this neuron. Okay? Notice that all of these things are at the cell body. None of them are going to be on anywhere else. So they only synapse there. So this is really not, these are not part of this neuron. And I generally don't test on them. Okay, so these big things here, which are normally long and kind of drawn out, but they've cut them off, these light gray things, are where incoming information comes in. And one of the reasons why so much information comes in through these is because these other neurons are synapsing with it. So these are called dendrites. Dendrites are responsible for incoming signals to the neuron. So the signal come in, is processed by the nucleus, and then a signal is sent out. Now the signal, which is called an action potential, which you will learn about it when you have physiology, or you should know all about if you've had physiology, is a signal sent out through the axon, which is right here. So this is the beginning of the axon, and they've got it, when you come to this section here, they have it what is called myelinated or wrapped, okay?
Sheath.
The myelin sheath. Now, if you remember from my lecture, if you saw that, if I've lectured on this so far, you remember that a signal, an electrical signal, which is what an action potential is, moves better and more quickly with less loss if it's insulated, the same way electricity moves through a wire across the ground if it has plastic around it, right? If you put bare wire across the ground, electricity wouldn't make it to the end because it would go down into the ground. That's why they called grounding it, right? Because that's where the electricity goes. So this wrapping here is called a myelin sheath. It's made out of fat. It's one of the reasons why babies need so much fat pre-birth and right after birth, is because they're producing these cells, which are basically wrappings and wrappings and wrappings. Now, the cell membrane, going all the way back to basic biology, is made of a phospholipid bilayer, lipid being fat, right? So if you take the membrane of something and wrap it around and around and around, get rid of all the liquid core, and just have a lot of wrappings of that phospholipid layer, you end up with this fatty wrapping, okay? I kind of like to call it the Cinnabon wrapping because it looks like a Cinnabon, right? And I relate everything to food. And how would you know that? Well, just look at me. Okay. So these are called Schwann cells. So I like to call them the ice cream cells. Yeah. More food, Mr. Sage? Yes. The Schwann cells, as in Schwann ice cream, right? You guys have heard of Schwann ice cream? Mm-hmm. So these are called the Schwann cells. And they wrap the axon to make sure the electrical signal going through it doesn't get lost into the surrounding tissue. Okay? Each of these gaps here, where my finger is called a node of Ranvier, or to use the American pronunciation, Ranvier. So this is where you guys need to take physiology. You'll learn what these nodes are for, why it needs to be wrapped so much, et cetera, et cetera. But to restate this gray thing here, that is the axon, the continuation of this. This is the Schwann cell. This pink thing is the Schwann cell nucleus. And then over here is what is called the endoneurium. So endoneurium means it's a connective tissue wrapping an individual axon to give it strength. Now, an individual axon has no strength by itself. It's just soft tissue. So if you don't want your nerve to tear, you have to put connective tissue around it, and that's what this endoneurium is for. Okay? I think I've hit all the key things for this model. This is called the neuron model. I hit the brain, hit the ventricles, and so now we're going to go to the cross-section of the spinal cord. Okay? In general, if I ask anything on the edge, it's the white matter of the spinal cord, and anything in the center is gray matter. Now, I may be asking the individual horns. I usually don't, but I will this time because you guys don't have any functions. Okay? One of the ways to know the difference here is if you look at this diagram, there's a really big V-shaped divot. The V-shaped divot is the anterior part of the spinal cord. That is towards the front of you. The posterior part is narrower. Does that make sense? So you know that anything across here is anterior, anything across here is posterior. So this thing coming into the spinal cord looks like a nerve, because it is. It's called the anterior root. And normally I ask the function of it, and the function is ironically right on this model, but people don't think about it. It says general, visceral, efferent, general somatic efferent. Now, what does efferent mean? Efferent means away from the brain to the muscles. So this is the motor part. This is the part that is going from the spinal cord out to the muscles to tell them to contract. Okay? So the posterior is the yellow and the green. And you can see it here, yellow and green. That says afferent. And afferent means inward. That's the sensory portion, okay? That's all the senses that you have, mostly from your skin, but also from your muscles, bringing signals in. Now, this here is called the posterior root ganglion. It's a swollen part of the yellow and green. Now, the reason why it's swollen here is because there's neurons coming in and neurons coming out, and they meet right at this ganglion, and there's a synapse. Now, why does it get so much fatter? Well, look at this model back over here. Right here, the axon, very narrow, right? But what's the fat part? The cell body. So when you have cell bodies articulating with other axons, you're going to have a swollen part because cell bodies are fatter than axons. Does that make sense? So you have a swollen section here called the posterior root ganglion. It's called a root because it's kind of rooting inwards towards the spinal cord.
Are the ganglions always on the posterior side?
In this case, yes, but ganglia can be wherever. It's just for the spinal cord, the ganglia are on the posterior root. Okay? And the last thing I'm going to teach you guys about is the horns, the gray horns. Okay, so which part is anterior? That way or this way?
This one.
Towards you guys, right? So anterior. So this is called the anterior gray horn because it's on the front. Okay? And what if it was on the side? What would be a good word for on the side?
Lateral.
Lateral horn. And then on the back?
Posterior.
Posterior horn. Okay? So this would be the anterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, posterior gray horn, and this is what is called the isthmus. And that is a tough word. It's ISTHMUS. Isthmus, which means a narrowing of the two sides of the gray matter.
Right, isthmus.
The isthmus. And then these gaps here, I'm not going to ask you guys. So that's it. That's the tour of the rest of the models for the lab exam. Okay?